over here in Cedar Rapids. I think conventional wisdom would have said to do this in Des Moines. However, it's important to send the message right from the beginning that Iowa is a much bigger state than just its capital city. Also, we are going to be getting around to all 99 counties, and especially over the next few days hitting several major cities, and so we felt that this would be a good place to start. The information I was waiting on, I learned from my last experience, this is very critically important to have. Corn $4.15 and beans $12.77. So I just want to get that out of the way, and I probably will get it out of the way every place I go, because if you don't know that, it just makes it a lot tougher to have a conversation with some journalists. You just can't tell them that that's not a governor's job knowing those prices. You just need to know them, and then you can move on to the rest of the conversation. I've had the opportunity to run for this position before. I learned from last time. I learned to stay in my party and fight for it, but I also learned that we can solve Iowa's problems. There are solutions out there. I believe in Iowa, and I believe in Iowans. I've had a chance to, since 2010, complete 2 99 county tours. I've had a chance to have a booth at the State Fair where I've interacted with tens of thousands of Iowans. Not only did we give them literature, but they interacted with me in a very, very positive way. Part of that was just the good fortune of being in the varied industry building across from the lottery and the restrooms. And we also learned. We learned that instead of having computers and giant state books and everything else, you have candy stations, a newspaper, and you just talk to and listen to folks. So it's been a very, very positive experience getting to know Iowans. And that's why I'm so positive and optimistic that we can restore our state to what it ought to be. Now, I have at times talked about the data that confirms that we face serious challenges. But I've done that, and I've done that, and I've done that. And as this campaign begins, I'm now putting away some of that. I'm going to focus on what we need to do to solve the problems, not just talk about the problems. The very first commitment that we need to make as Iowans, and that I would make as Iowa's next governor, that my administration would make, would be to resume what 50 years ago fell short. And that is an unconditional war on poverty. 50 years ago this month, Lyndon Johnson declared a bold and unconditional war on poverty. And he laid out a vision on how we could achieve victory in that unrelenting war. Unfortunately, Vietnam followed, and the ability to realize that ambition fell to the wayside. But we have no such obstacles in Iowa in the year 2014. We have the resources, we have the ability, we have the knowledge, we have the technology to end poverty in this state. What we've lacked is leadership with the will to do it. As Iowa's next governor, it will be the single most important task of my administration. Now, in order to be able to get to the point where we can effectively impact poverty in Iowa, we must first and foremost begin addressing the accountability of government. In his speech, Lyndon Johnson said we need honest, efficient, and frugal government. He said if we could go through and examine those areas where we had waste and where we needed to eliminate, then we could make the bold investments we needed to in education, in health, in our children, in training and such things. Just as he said then that we need to have efficient, honest, frugal government, in Iowa we need efficient, honest, and frugal government. And so what we have to do is not only conduct a thorough examination of state government and find where we can save, But we also need to end the cronyism that has dominated recent administrations, especially the Branstad administration. We cannot afford to spend $1.5 million to create a job for Orascom. We cannot afford to invest in the type of development that simply makes no sense. In our state, we will reward a contractor with subsidies if they pour concrete over our rich black soil, and then we will use tax dollars to put in roads and poles and sewers. While if that same developer were to go in dying rural Iowa or decaying urban Iowa and pull plywood off of good buildings where there are already roads and poles and sewers, we tax them. That makes no sense. And a number of other things we do make no sense. And so we must begin the process of restoring balance and equity to the way we govern this state. Now, there are some specific things we need to prioritize. I said before, and I would say again, that the very first act of my new administration would be to pull together or to empower a commission that will look at how we save our public pensions. Now, this is more urgent than it's ever been, particularly in light of a recent federal ruling. Because the people who went into our buildings that were burning, the people who made our streets safe, the people who taught our children, deserve for us to honor our promise to them. We must make that in a way that is actuarially sound and sustainable, but we cannot break our promise to these individuals. And so that would be the very first thing I would do. The second thing I would do as an administration would be to restore confidence in local and state governments by issuing this bold action. To call in the head of the Division of Criminal Investigation, to sit down and say, I need a process, return in 30 days, how we're going to begin forensic audits from one end of this state to the other. This is our government. We have paid for it. And yet in community after community after community, we have seen where public servants have failed in their fiduciary responsibilities. In Des Moines, when I was on the school board, we had a contractor that was billing us for time that didn't exist. They had a $20 million contract. It was an egregious offense. But what was equally egregious was that media participated in covering up that fraud. Just as media in this state has not reported on the massive fraud that is the funding of non-existent students to the potential to the upwards to $750 million a year. In fact, I had a chance to sit down with my opponent, Jack Hatch. Together we fought like warriors to end this fraud years ago. We had the incontrovertible proof and data from the Iowa Department of Revenue and other sources. We had on tape, for example, Cedar Rapids Assistant Superintendent admitting that when students drop out, if we ask them if they're coming back and they say yes, we just keep them on the books. We not only had it on tape, but it played on statewide radio. Yet the media refused to cover it. Politicians refused to address it. And it is a fraud that cost us significantly because we cannot pay teachers properly. We cannot fund the kind of curriculum we ought to. Students go without books and the ability to take them home because we have ignored this kind of fraud. So cleaning up state and local government has to be a priority because we cannot get to the next level without it. We also must address justice in this state. There is a profound disparity that exists in justice in the state, especially linked to what has been deemed the war on drugs, which is in reality a war on those who can't afford legal representation. I was at the Martin Luther King program in Des Moines yesterday, and Pastor Bobby Young, the head of the Iowa Urban Initiative, is a staunch advocate of reform of the justice system. They physically go with young people into the courtrooms. And he spoke of an instance that he personally witnessed where an affluent young man facing his fourth drug possession charge who got busted with a half a pound of dope was fined $3,000, and afterwards a young urban male who had this much pot was given a year. That is not uncommon in Iowa. Because justice is not based upon evidence and facts and evidence. It is based upon the attorney you have and whether you can plead affluenza, which has not only been a defense in Texas, but too often a defense in Iowa. So we must restore justice. And finally, we must create efficiency within the way we administer government. If you look at the state flow chart, it is just a convolution that makes no sense. Take, for example, the Department of Inspection and Appeals. You have racing, gaming, and bingo, but you don't have lottery in the under the same umbrella, even though they're on gambling. But you do have the public defender that's in the same agency as racing and gaming, but it's not in the same bureaucracy as disproportionate confinement or criminal juvenile justice and planning. Now, I've talked to legislative leaders, members of the Branstad and Culver administrations. I haven't had a chance to talk to Governor Branstad in depth about this. No one can make sense of this. But the administration of governance has not been a priority of this and other administrations. That's why boards and commissions are too often loaded with contributors and not the best Iowans to serve the policy engine of state government. So we will fix these things. After we restore integrity of government, we must turn our attention to rebuilding Iowa's economy. Now, I come out of the tradition of the type of Democrats that in some instances don't exist anymore. When we look at a Lyndon Johnson, a John Kennedy, a Franklin Roosevelt, full employment was a goal with dignity, respect, and responsibility. We ought to have full employment as a priority, but in a way that's constructive and contributes and benefits all of society. So full employment with dignity is absolutely a top priority of mine. But also, and this is interesting when you look at his speech to Congress when he declared his war on poverty, he said, but we will also balance the budget and we will even cut or discount taxes. I don't know how it became a staple of the Democratic Party to raise taxes on folks like single moms working 3 jobs and then to hand them over to prominent contractors and the wealthy and in Iowa to give them the tax credits that sometimes if you don't use them, you still get a check. One of the reasons why I developed the tax reform policies I had, and we'll roll this out in more detail later on in the campaign, is because at 3:47 a.m. I was driving through Hardee's in 2010. It was April 16, 2010. And I did a really good job losing weight and getting in shape. And in fact, over the last couple of years, I've swapped out about 50 pounds of muscle for 50 pounds of fat, and I can wear my dad's suits again. I'm happy about that. I still have work to do. But that day, I deserved a break. I just spoke to Iowans for tax relief, and I deserved a break. So I went to Hardee's, and I know it was 3:47 a.m. because at 4 they stopped serving the good stuff. I made sure I was there on time. And the young lady who was working had a high school student who was ready for prom. She had to get a prom dress. She had an infant, and she had to be at her second job at 8 a.m. And it does not make sense to me to tax her income, her overtime, or to raise her gas tax so you can give that money to Orascom so that some financial advisor can then say they're a good investment. We have these priorities wrong. We ought to be protecting our families and our children. When you have a single mom working 2 and 3 jobs, one of them at 4 a.m., she ought not be financing millionaires and billionaires just because they write checks to Governor Branstad. And my administration will end that foolishness. Ending cronyism is critical. Also, one of the strengths I believe we bring to this race is the ability to achieve bipartisanship. I've always believed kingdoms are built through war, but empires through peace. And I've had the knack of being able to go to people I once fought against and turn them into allies. Once upon a time, Jack Hatch and I battled. And so when we launched our initiative a decade ago, I said, Jack, I need you to be our chief legislative liaison on the Democratic side. And he said yes, and then I went to Cedar Rapids, Chuck Larson, who was the chair of the state Republican Party. I said, Chuck, I need you to work with Jack. And I put those two together, and they fought for education reform. And I pulled Branstad's former chief of staff, Gretchen Tiegler, together with Bob Heelan out of Burlington, the Democratic mayor. And they worked for reform on our behalf. And I even pulled together Doug Gross and Chet Covert before they both announced for governor and well, whatever they ran. And they worked also on our behalf for education reform and some other things. Most recently, I pulled together a K.O. Abdul Samad and Deb Berry, very, very liberal Democrats, and Kevin Costner and Brad Zahn, who was a congressional nominee chosen by Republicans, two very conservative Republicans, and they put forward the Every Working Iowa Economic Empowerment Act, which creates a path to revitalize our economy, rebuild our food economy, and to grow wealth from within for Iowans. It is an amazing proposal. It is one of the things I'm most proud of, that I was able to pull together those individuals. We have a picture with Brad Zahn with his arms around Pastor Bobby Young in Mount Hebron Baptist Church where the announcement was made. And it's an example of how we can pull together. This administration will pull together leaders from all parties, regardless of their professed ideological leanings, because I know there are good Republicans and good Democrats. When we talk about the problems, we argue, but when we talk about the solutions, we can work together. So it's not just enough to have ideas. The ability to pull together individuals to drive solutions is critical, and also the ability to engage the public in a way that leads to solutions is critical. The day before I got elected to the Des Moines School Board, a local radio show host by the name of J. Michael McCoy made a list. In less than 2 years on the board, despite the register's nonstop media frenzied coverage of irrelevance, despite my board members threatening censure and requesting I be prosecuted and thrown off the board, every single thing on that list got checked off. On July 3rd, 2009, I went back on that radio show's whole show. He produced the list. Everything on the list got checked off. But guess what? That same Dick Murphy, who tried to get me censored and tried to get me prosecuted and tried to get me thrown off the board, now writes for the Bystander. He chairs our endorsement committee. And he even said at Charlie's Speakeasy, Chicago Speakeasy, when we had lunch last month, well, John, we all knew you were right. We just didn't like the way you were saying it. And he's an ally. And that's the kind of leadership we need. Leadership that can look beyond political and partisan differences and say, if you really care, then let's do what's right and struggle until we do what's right. Also, to impact and help our unconditional war on poverty in Iowa, we must invoke what Johnson described as the chief weapon, or the most important weapon in that battle, and that is education. Now, there are some immediate things we need to do. My administration, day one, will send a note to Washington, D.C. saying we are opting out of No Child Left Behind. We have good schools, we have good teachers, we have committed individuals in the classroom, but No Child Left Behind has perverted education in America in general and Iowa specifically. Politicians driven by their ambitions created education legislation that would allow them to boast about what they're doing without thought of consequence. I hosted a radio show in Waterloo for years, and I saw good educators forced to move or were stressed out because of this horrible, horrible legislation. You cannot find educators that say it's a good idea. But politicians keep it because it's easy. As my administration would opt out day one of No Child Left Behind. We would also go after and end the fraud of funding non-existent students. We'd also rein in the bureaucracy. Understand this, Iowa, once upon a time, had 40 4,652 school districts, 1950-51, but it did not have 4,652 bureaucracies. It had county superintendents, and then the county superintendency evolved into regional support associations called area education associations, which could perform superintendent functions, and it was a really good idea. For example, the DeWitt School District contracted their superintendency with the Mississippi Bend AEA for $14,000, allowing all the rest of that money to be put back in the classroom. It worked so well, the big district said, stop it. Can't offer that. Now, we currently have a travesty in our state. For example, we have a school district with 94 students, 2 business managers, a board secretary, a student secretary, a transportation director, an assistant transportation director, some of them with last names, I'm sure that's strictly coincidental, and 94 students. I live in Des Moines where we have 63 schools. Every single school is much bigger than the school district. I said to Connie Bozen, who, when my first day on the school board, we agreed not to talk for at least the time we served together. Now we laugh and talk, and I love going to her Appalicious booth at the state fair. Probably the healthiest thing there. And I said, Connie, can you imagine if every Des Moines school added 2 business managers, a board secretary, 2 transportation directors? I attended a school district. They had 1 school, was their school district, and they were contemplating adding a principal for kindergartens. I had a chance to go to a school district, 200 kids, 3 principals, and a superintendent. We cannot continue to invest in this massive bureaucracy, and our Regents institutions, 45,000 employees approximately for 70,000 students. We are required by law to have 1 adult for every 10 4-year-olds, but we have 2 adults for every 3 college-age students. And I used to carry around the chart to show the job breakdown, to show that all those jobs aren't critical to educating our young people. And so we need to eliminate that. And once we eliminate it, we can make a serious investment in expanding early childhood education the way we ought to, fully funding access for 3 and 4-year-olds on a voluntary basis, the same way we do with kindergarten, expanding to a K-14 structure where at the junior year in high school you now enter a vocational education track, a college prep track, and we need that because 80% of our kids that graduate to stay in the state aren't college ready when they go there, or remediation. Now, I would much rather pay to provide vocational and technical education and expanded education for our young people than fund 2 business managers and 2 transportation directors in a district with 1/4 of the students as King Elementary in Des Moines. I would also rather pay for a free college education to any student who says, we will stay in the state a year for every year you pay for, and we will give you 40 hours community service a summer. We need to keep our young people here. We're losing them. And we can pay for it if we end the white-collar welfare and the massive investment in unnecessary construction that we have in our schools. We're spending millions of dollars of construction money building athletic facilities in districts that can't afford books and to pay their teachers. Because we have to spend it on construction because the legislature voted construction money. It's ridiculous, and we need to end that foolishness. Just a couple of last things. We need to be a healthy Iowa. Now, I'm proud of some of the work Jack's done on health. We're the one who got him involved in health care when we did our groundbreaking health and education hearings. I said to Jack, who was at that time the chair of the Economic Development Committee, Jack, you're our chief legislative liaison. We need you to start working on health. But we can't just work on how we pay for people to be sick. We really have misnamed this entire conversation. It should be illness maintenance conversation, not health care. I want to promote health. There was a time when I had to drive around with a bottle of aspirin in my cars, and I'd stop at the hospital and they'd say it's a miracle I didn't have a stroke. We need to have, by example, show Iowans how they can lose weight, how they can get healthy the right way, how they, we need to fight obesity, especially amongst our children. And that is best done by example. I was at the Martin Luther King program yesterday, and there was this little kid who was helping to direct the choir, the cutest little kid, and he would watch the director, and he would follow the example. We need a better example for our young people and for Iowans. And I think in the area of health, I provide a pretty good example. In fact, I hope before the end of my administration to one day be able to lift my shirt up and show my 8-pack. That might not happen now, but it is a goal and a dream. Finally, let me say this. I don't have all the answers. I don't. But that's not the governor's job. The governor's job is to find good people who are smart and smarter than him, and to surround himself with these people, but also to make sure that they have the right moral compass, that they first and foremost as public servants are going to put the interests of Iowans, our taxpayers, our families, and our children above personal ambition and politics and greed. And I think I'll be able to do that. To find competent people and to find committed people. That's what we have not had with Governor Branstad. And unfortunately, Democrats in the Senate have gone along with virtually everything he's wanted to do. Some of them have benefited personally from this alliance. Others have just found it easier to go along to get along. That's not good enough for Iowans. So I'm going to answer that last question that is usually the first question I get. Because even my opponent said years ago when he introduced me for the school board, Jonathan Narcisse is a man of courage and conviction. I've rarely had people challenge me on what I want to do. I've rarely had people challenge me on the data, because I'm a data guy. I can't get away with hope and change and that deep voice, so I have to actually have facts and data and be able to back it up. But the question they ask is, can you win? Well, I set 3 criteria for entering this race. 1, could I put together an organization? I had already received support from every single county in the state and nearly every single precinct, so that was the first and easiest thing to do. 2, could I raise money? The answer is, I will be able to raise enough money to run an effective campaign. Absolutely. And then the third is, could I win? I'll be honest with you, if I were going head-to-head against Tyler Olson with the support he had from county chairs and unions and others, I wouldn't run against him, not head-to-head. And Bob Kraus would have been tough, because Bob Kraus had a progressive tone that appealed to a lot of Democrats. That's why he was beating Jack Hatch in the Iowa poll that the Register continues to ignore. If you go back and look at the Iowa poll, Bob Kraus was beating Jack Hatch even though the Register ignored him. Bob Kraus had good positives and he had low negatives. I like Jack Hatch personally, but I can beat Jack Hatch. I know I can. Doesn't mean I will. But to answer that question I'm constantly asked, can I win the nomination? Absolutely. I expect to. I have better name recognition than Jack. I have higher positives. I've proven I can get votes from every single county in this state. He hasn't proven much outside of Polk County. I got elected by blue-collar Democrats. The rich ones don't always like me. But I dominated blue-collar Democrat precincts. And so I absolutely feel confident that I will be the nominee of the Democratic Party. And then we'll see what happens with Governor Branstad. But it would be premature to talk about him other than his failed administration, because I have a tough opponent ahead of me. On that note, I thank you all for being here, and I don't know if you have any questions, but I would be glad to answer any that you have.